Iyov continues his long soliloquy, speech to his friends, to God, to himself, to the reader. Who knows? But let's read it. Vayosef Iyov se'et mishalo vayomar. So Iyov continued with his parables, with his themes, with his words, and said as follows: Mi yitneni ki archei kedem, ki me Eloah yishmereni. Right? So if I could only go back to the good old days, when God was Yishmereni, when God watched over me. Much of the book Iyov says that God has watched over him, which is not what he wants. He wants God to leave him alone. But in the olden days, when things were good, he very much wanted to be part of, God watching over him. And he's going to wax nostalgic. Bihilo Nero Ale Roshi, Leoro Elech Choshech. When God, right, God's lamp shone over my head. When I walked in the dark by its light. Kasher Haiti Bimei Chorpi, Besod Eloah Ale Ohali. When I was in my prime, when God's company graced my tent, and you see there a little bit, of linguistic Eloha Ohali, right? Words that sound similar. My tent, and God is in my tent. Ba'od Shaddai Imadi Sevivotai Ne'arai. When Shaddai, another name for God, was still with me, when my young ones, my na'arim, presumably his children, surrounded me. Birchotz halichai b'chema v'tzur yatsuk imadi palge shamen. When my feet were bathed in cream, not sure what that means, but okay, right? Things were good. He was wealthy. That's what it means. And rocks poured out streams of oil for me. He was a Saudi Arabian oil producer or something. Bitseiti sha'ar ale karet, barchov achin moshavi. When I passed through the city gates to take my seat in the square, right? He was a person of importance, a person who sat in the court, a person who made decisions for people and for his city. He was going to take his seat on the city council or whatever it might be. Ra'uni ne'arim v'nechba'u v'shishim kamu amadu. Young men saw me and hid. Elders rose and stood. So presumably, right, the young men see him and they're scared, right? They would hide from him, while the elders who respected him, even though perhaps he was younger than them and they were elders, they stood. They understood he was a person of Yeshivas. He was a person who was important and significant. Sarim atzru v'milim v'chaf yasimu lefihem. Nobles held back their words. They clapped their hands to their mouths. Kol nigidim nechba'u uleshonam lechikam daveka. The voices of princes were hushed. Their tongues stuck to the palate when they would see Iyov, because he was a person that they were scared of. He was a person of great significance, and they were worried about saying something dumb, something incriminating, whatever it might be. As we're taught in the book of Mishlei, that the best way to show off your wisdom is or the best way to show off your lack of wisdom is by opening your mouth. Continue verse 11. Ki ozen sham'a v'te'ashreni v'ayin ra'ata v'ti'ideni. The ear that heard me acclaimed me. The eye that saw me commended me. So this is the back when things were good. And, everybody looks back in time and remembers the good old days and all that and whatnot. But for Iyov, it's certainly a real thing. There were those good old days, and it was days, right? He talks about there was light for him when he was walking through darkness. And it's impossible not to think, of course, of Tehillim, Perek, Chaf Gimel, Gam Kielech, Begeit, Salmavet, even as I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right? Lo irara ki ata imadi. I'm not scared because you are with me. You comfort me, God. You're there for me. And Iyov, that's who Iyov was. And Iyov was respected, and God was with him, and everything seemed great. And why was he respected, and why was God with him? Now he's going to tell us that he was a good dude. We're in verse 12. Pasuk Yud Bet. Ki amalet ani mishaveh viatom velo ozer lo. Because I saved the poor man who cried out, the orphan who had none to help him. Birkat oved alai tavo velev almana arnein. I received the blessing of the lost. I gladdened the heart, right? Rinana, of the widow. Tzedek lavashti v'yil basheni. Kimi'il v'tzanif mishpati. I clothed myself in righteousness and it robed me. Justice was my cloak and turban. Interesting, we think about the right God. It talks about God being what God is lovesh, right? Well, az hitazar, right? What is God wearing? What garment? And so here Iyov is talking about himself. And maybe there's an illusion here, as you're probably thinking, right? God is supposed to be the judge, and Iyov is saying God is not the right judge and not a good judge. I'm the one who has been lovesh tzedakot. I'm the one who's clothed myself in righteousness. That's why I was respected. Einaim in verse 15, Haiti la iver viraglaim la piseach ani. I was the eyes to the blind and the feet to the lame. Av anochi la evyonim v'riv lo yadati ech karehu. I was the father to the needy, and I looked in the case of the stranger to try to help somebody who nobody else wanted to help. Va'ashabra mital ot aval umishinav ashlich taraf. I broke the jaws of the wrongdoer, and I wrested prey from his teeth. Va'omar im kini egva v'chachol arbe yamim. I thought I would end my days with my family, and I would be as living as long as the sands. You may have there in your English where there's a translation that's given the phoenix. It's not clear exactly where it, how the phoenix. We know the phoenix, the idea of this bird that I don't know, lives 1,000 years and comes back to life, etc., etc. So he's saying that he's using perhaps an idea that was known in Greek culture for sure. That's where this idea of the phoenix comes from. But chol is sand. And there are many places, and I think about every time, 20 or so times in the Tanakh, we have the word chol for sand. Chol, it means sand, not like chol hamoed or chol versus the week versus Shabbat, not kodesh uchol. Chol here means sand, and right when God tells Avram, He says your people are going to be as numerous as the sands of the sea. Right, and even though the ocean is coming in, the sand still remains there. The sand lasts forever. The sand is an idea of eternity as well. Not that Iyov thought he was going to be eternal, but that he would be alive there with his wife, with his children, his sons and his daughters, with his grandchildren, and perhaps more. And that's what he thought his life was going to be. And that's, again, part of the great difficulty here is the question of somebody who did everything right and saw things were headed in a certain direction. And of course, in this book, we know for no good reason other than sort of God's sort of wager and with the Satan and challenge, it wouldn't have gotten there. So he's expressing this sadness in this chapter. Continue in 19. He's going to continue similarly. Sharshi patuach elei mayim vital yalin bik tziri. My roots reaching water, and dew lying on my branches. Kivodi chadashi madi vikashti biadi tachalif. My vigor refreshed, my bow ever new in my hand. Li shamu v'yichelu. V'yidmu limo atzati. Men would listen to me expectingly and wait for my counsel. Right, so he's going back to the parts of what he talked about of him as a person who was well respected, a person who people listened to. That's who he was, and he expected to have that long life. And continuing within verse 22, Acharei divari lo yishnu va'alemo titof milati. After I spoke, they had nothing to say. My words were as drops of dew upon them. That, or they didn't understand or agree with anything he said, but that's his understanding of what would happen. Everybody was so blown away by his wisdom. V'yichalu chamatar li ufihem pa'aru l'malkosh. They waited for me as for rain. For the late rain, their mouths open wide. So here we look at what he uses, right? In verse 22, he talks about the dew. And in verse 23, he talks about the rain. And right, he's sort of way I like to see this chapter almost, and said this before, it's almost like he's sort of taking this idea of almost eternity and godliness into himself. He's the one who's lovesh that stakot. He's the one who was providing them with the stuff that was like rain and dew. So he's sort of saying many of the things that we would expect God to do. He's the one who's doing them. Continuing 24. Eschak aleihem lo ya'aminu v'or panai lo yapilun. When I smiled at them, they would not believe it. They never expected a sign of my favor. Evchar darkam ve'eshev rosh veshkon kamelech bagdud kasher avelim yinachem. I decided their course. I presided over them. I lived like a king amongst his troops, like one who consoles mourners. I was a person who was well respected. I was the person who people turned to. I was the person who gave them advice. I was the person who was above them, like the king in battle. And at the same time, where I was respected and honored and perhaps feared, and people were in awe of me, at the same time, I was also a person of kindness. I was also a person who consoled the mourners. And so Iyov looks back here, and it's a very, very sad thing. It's a very, very sad chapter of somebody who, we know the story, had everything, but to hear him say it in his own words, what his expectations were, what he thought would be his end. And it looks very, very different what he believes he deserved and what we as the readers understand he deserved versus the situation that he finds us in. And that's the continuation. We'll continue further come tomorrow. Tomorrow, the next chapter is going to start with sort of what is today. It's like we have the Kinan on Tisha B'Av, B'Tzeiti mi Mitzrayim, B'Tzeiti mi Yerushalayim. We compare the beauty of leaving Egypt and then the desecration and devastation of leaving Jerusalem after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And tomorrow we're going to start with that was then, and this is now. And this is going to be a very, very different reality, sadly, that he finds himself in.